need to or could, or the evidence doesn't establish it. Now, there's one other paragraph about this. In making this determination, we noted that the special counsel recognized that, quote, the evidence does not establish that the president was involved in an underlying crime related to Russian election interference, close quote, and that while not determinative, the absence of such evidence bears upon the president's intent with respect to obstruction. Generally speaking, to obtain and sustain an obstruction conviction, the government would need to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that a person acting with corrupt intent engaged in obstructive conduct with a sufficient nexus to a pending or contemplated proceeding. In cataloging the president's actions, many of which took place in public view, the report identifies no actions that, in our judgment, constitute obstructive conduct, had a nexus to a pending or contemplated proceeding, and were done with corrupt intent, each of which, under the department's principles of federal prosecution, guiding charging decisions, would need to be proven beyond a reasonable doubt to establish an obstruction of justice offense. So then it goes on to say, the letter says that under the regulations, the special counsel's report is confidential. He says, I am mindful, this is Barr speaking again, I am mindful of the public interest in this matter. For that reason, my goal and intent is to release as much of the special counsel's report as I can, consistent with applicable law, regulations, and departmental policies. Then he goes on to say, after looking at it, it's apparent that the report contains material that is or could be subject to federal rules of criminal procedure 6E. Now, that's the rule that says grand jury material is secret and can't be released. Rule 6E generally limits disclosure of certain grand jury information. Disclosure of that material beyond the strict limits set forth in the rule is a crime in certain circumstances. The restriction protects the integrity of grand jury proceedings and ensures that the unique and invaluable investigative powers of a grand jury are used strictly for their intended criminal function. Given these restrictions, the schedule for processing the report depends in part on how quickly the department can identify the 6E material, that's the grand jury material, that can't be made public. I've asked for the assistance of the special counsel in identifying all the 6E material information contained in the report as quickly as possible. Separately, I must identify any information that could impact other ongoing matters, including those the special counsel has referred to other offices. As soon as that's done, I'll be in a position to move forward expeditiously in determining what can be released in light of applicable law, regulations, and department policies, and it's signed William Barr, Attorney General. So I think the headline here is that the Attorney General has concluded, based on the fact that Robert Mueller's investigation didn't say one way or the other whether the president obstructed justice, that they've looked at the law, they've looked at the facts, and they've determined that he did not, and that he therefore wasn't indicted, and it had nothing to do with the fact that longstanding Justice Department policy that you can't indict a sitting president. Now, I would say one other thing here, Kate. This whole question of grand jury material came up in the Watergate as well. And you may remember that in that investigation, the Watergate grand jury actually prepared a report and sent it to Congress once a federal judge signed off on it. But a critical fact when the judge looked at that about whether this grand jury stuff could be sent to Congress was the fact that the president at the time, President Nixon, didn't object to that material going to the Hill. If Donald Trump were to object to it, it might be a very different story. But for now, this is all the Congress is going to get. The Attorney General is saying it's going to take a while to see how much more I can give you.
And Pete, on Friday, the president did say publicly he would like for this report to be made available to the public. Can I go back with you? I feel like we're running a law course this afternoon. Some of what you just read cold on the air is a lot of legalese. So go back one more time. You're saying the key sentence there about the Mueller report is, while it does not conclude the president committed a crime, it also does not exonerate him. But then in the paragraphs following that, what happens is the Attorney General weighs in on whether the president did commit a crime of obstructing justice or not.
Yes, and before I get back to that, can I read one other key sentence that just stands out to me as I read the rest of this? They talk a lot about how the special counsel, his main homework assignment was to determine whether anyone in the Trump campaign helped the Russians meddle in the investigation. And there's a long section here that talks about all the work that Mueller's team did on that. And then there is this. The special counsel did not find that the Trump campaign or anyone associated with it conspired or coordinated with the Russian government in these efforts, despite multiple offers from Russian-affiliated individuals to assist in the Trump campaign. So I guess what you could say is that the Attorney General is saying Mueller has concluded there was, as the president so often says, no collusion. But I'll leave that to others. The fact is, he says the special counsel did not find that the Trump campaign or anyone associated with it conspired or coordinated with the Russian government in those meddling efforts, Kate.
Yeah, that's going to be a key quote. Pete, thank you. Can we go back to be very crystal clear on the earlier part of what you were saying? The Attorney General of the United States has looked at the evidence presented by Mueller and concluded, it sounds to me like concluded, that there is no reason to think that the president obstructed justice. Is that right?
So here's the key sentence, I think. This is Attorney General William Barr saying that he and Rod Rosenstein, who's the Deputy Attorney General who oversaw the special counsel investigation from its inception, Rosenstein's the guy who brought Mueller in, he says, the deputy and I have concluded that the evidence developed by the special counsel's investigation is not sufficient to establish that the president committed an obstruction of justice offense. And then he says, and we made that decision setting aside, without regard to this whole separation of powers question about whether you can even indict a sitting president. He's saying the evidence isn't there. And he goes on in that second paragraph to say, one of the hardest things about making any obstruction case is the intent of the person who took these actions. And they're saying in cataloging the president's action, the report identifies no actions that, in our judgment, constitute obstructive conduct, had a nexus, a connection to a pending or contemplated proceeding, and were done, I guess you could say, or were done with corrupt intent, all of which are basically the elements of proving an obstruction crime.
And Pete, does the letter you're holding get into other areas? Should we let you read that for a moment, or have we highlighted most of what's in that letter to Congress?
So, as I say, it's 4 pages. It's basically a summary. The fact that the special counsel employed 19 lawyers, assisted by a team of 40 FBI agents. Special counsel issued more than 2,800 subpoenas, we learn here. Executed nearly 500 search warrants, got more than 230 orders for communication records, issued almost 50 orders authorizing the use of pen registers. Those are those things that record the number that a phone dialed without recording the conversation, and made 13 requests to foreign governments for evidence and interviewed about 500 witnesses. But the rest of it is a summary, I think, of things that were already known, including the Russians who were indicted for hacking and for setting up those phony social media accounts.
Pete Williams, you are invaluable to us. Thank you so much. Let me put you on hold for a moment and go over to the White House. NBC News Chief White House Correspondent Hallie Jackson is with us. Hallie, everything Pete just said, I imagine, is going to be very welcome news at the White House.
Well, I will tell you this. We have reached out to White House officials, our sources in and around the West Wing, the president's legal team as well. And as soon as we hear from them, Kate, we'll bring you up to speed. I can tell you that we are, in some instances, sharing in real time what this letter says. It sounds as though everybody's seeing it at the same time. Members of Congress, members of the media, Jerry Nadler, of course, putting out that sort of blast that he has received this. Let me put this into 2 different buckets, Kate, if you will. And you and Pete so expertly went through this. There is the coordination conspiracy bucket that the special counsel looked into. There is the obstruction bucket. The key thing, and the sentence that I think you are going to hear again and again from the president's allies and from this White House, is that line about how the special counsel did not find that the Trump campaign or anyone associated with it conspired or coordinated with the Russian government in these efforts. The White House will look at this and will point to this as vindication, as validation, in their view, to everything that they and the president have been saying over these 675-plus days now that Robert Mueller has been working on this report and has been conducting this investigation. The other bucket, obstruction, this is where it gets trickier because there is no clear-cut answer from the special counsel saying that while the president, there is no evidence, if you will, that a crime was committed, this does not exonerate him. Watch for Democrats, particularly on Capitol Hill, Kate, to sees on this piece of it, that is going to be where I think you'll see a lot of the focus coming up and a big argument, a big driver of why Democrats on the Hill want to see more of Robert Mueller's report. They want to see the underlying documents and information, Kate.
Let me bring in Chuck Todd, NBC News political director, moderator of Meet the Press. Chuck, you've been listening to all of this. Politically speaking, where are we?
Oh, I think the president's going to feel quite vindicated on this, because what is going to be in dispute is going to be how he conducted himself. What is not going to be in dispute is that what Hallie pointed out first and foremost, and what they are going to scream over and over again, which is Bob Mueller did not find anything about coordination with Trump officials, and that it will be Bob Mueller's word, that they will take that as the full exoneration. They will view the obstruction as this is sort of Democrats looking for a redo or looking for a process. They'll use all sorts of words like that. And I think because the dispute will be that, and look, I think Democrats very fairly will say, well, wait a minute, if this doesn't exonerate them on the obstruction question, then if you haven't resolved obstruction, how do you resolve collusion? Because if you didn't get cooperation and they obstructed in the investigation, could you necessarily get to the bottom of the collusion question? But Kate, I'll be honest with you, I think that is a hard political argument to make for Democrats to push as hard as perhaps some would like them to push.
Chuck, let me jump back to Hallie Jackson with some initial reaction. Hallie?
Very quickly, the first White House official we're hearing from, Dan Scavino, who runs the president's social media accounts, pointing to exactly that line we just discussed, saying, as we pointed to for the past 2 years, no conspiracy or coordination with Russia, Kate. So an early indication that that's going to be the focus from the White House.
All right, Hallie Jackson, Chuck Todd, and of course, Pete Williams, thanks so much. We will, of course, continue to monitor developments throughout this Sunday. We'll be back for a full report on NBC Nightly News tonight. Also, you can get all the latest on the NBC News app. For now, I'm Kate Snow, NBC News, New York.
That didn't happen.
So the report says, and this is a quote not from Barr's letter, but it's Barr quoting the Mueller report. Quote, "The investigation did not establish that members of the Trump campaign conspired or coordinated with the Russian government in its election interference activities."
So on the issue of obstruction, Pete, if AG Bill Barr and Rod Rosenstein say that they don't have evidence of obstruction, what are we expecting to hear from Congress on this?
So I'll leave that to your guesses as good as mine on that. But what they're saying is that the evidence that they have isn't sufficient to establish, to justify filing obstruction charges, setting aside the question of whether the president can indeed be charged with a crime or not. They say they never actually, I mean, my assumption is they're saying that we never got to that point, or it didn't matter. We never actually got that far. We didn't have to go through the door and ask that question because we didn't have enough information to say that that these actions did reach the threshold of being a crime for the reasons of intent and all the other factors that they cite in the letter.
Kristen Welker, have we heard from the White House?
We're getting our first small reaction from the White House, Katie. This comes from Dan Scavino in a tweet, one of President Trump's top advisors. He tweets out, "Fact. As we've been saying for the past 2 years, the special counsel's investigation did not find that the Trump campaign or anyone associated with it conspired or coordinated with Russia in its efforts to influence the 2016 U.S. presidential election." So the victory lap has begun. This is from Lindsey Graham, an ally of President Trump's, who says this: "I have just received top-line findings from Attorney General Barr. Good day for the rule of law. Great day for President Trump and his team. No collusion, no obstruction. The cloud hanging over President Trump has been removed by this report. Bad day for those hoping the Mueller investigation would take President Trump down." He's, of course, the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, Katie. We are awaiting response from Democrats now to your question: what happened happens next? What do we expect to hear from lawmakers on Capitol Hill? Well, I think you might hear a battle over how much of this report gets released. Now, this is going to be the big question mark. Is President Trump going to say, release the entire report? This report says, according to what we've just heard from Pete Williams, there was no obstruction, no collusion. So will President Trump, in fact, he's already said he wants the whole report released. But what specifically does that mean? We know that there might be some parts of the report that might be deemed protected by executive privilege. Might President Trump say, look, Democrats want to see this full report. We're going to now be more cooperative. We'll have to wait and see. Now, President Trump about to leave Florida, Katie. He lands here just after 6. So we will have a chance to hopefully get reaction from the president himself to all of this. Again, a remarkable day in the Trump presidency, and certainly something that you can expect to see him use out on the campaign trail as he tries to win re-election, Katie.
Let's bring in Chuck Todd. Chuck, just to recap for our viewers, from the summary that was given to lawmakers from Bill Barr on Robert Mueller's findings, he found that, 1, there was no tacit or express agreement by anybody on the Trump campaign team or Trump himself or within Trump's orbit to coordinate or conspire with Russia to affect the election. The other thing is on obstruction. They compiled all of the evidence on both sides on obstruction and allowed Bill Barr and Deputy AG Rod Rosenstein to make the determination whether or not the president obstructed justice. And both Barr and Rosenstein have said that they do not believe that the president obstructed justice. This, I imagine, is a good day for the president. He must be feeling relatively good right now.
He is, and he's probably feeling relatively good about his selection of Bill Barr as his Attorney General, because this memo and the initial understanding of what's in the Mueller report, this will color what's in the Mueller report before any of us actually see it. And so the two big determinations being, one, no evidence of any conspiracy with Russia in the Trump campaign. But the second, on obstruction, boy, I tell you, you know, Katie, it's very confusing in here. The report did not make a decision on obstruction. It's the Attorney General that's making a decision on obstruction. We already know he had a very expansive view of executive power on this front. So that isn't going to resolve the obstruction question as far as congressional Democrats are concerned in general, and probably many members of legal community. I think this is going to be a debate. But you can't have the debate until you see the actual evidence of the obstruction. And I'll just say this. I think politically, the president is being done a huge favor here by the fact that there is a predetermination on what the obstruction is from the Attorney General without anybody else seeing that evidence. And yes, it was Bob Mueller who left it to the AG and the Deputy AG. But again, it is their interpretation on this, not Mueller's, nor anybody else who's read this.
And that's not going to sit well with congressional leaders.
No,
it's also not going to sit well with a number of voters out there who want to see all of the evidence. Are we going to hear the same calls from Republicans going forward to see the entire report, to see what Bob Mueller compiled on the question of obstruction?
On paper, you would think this should be an easy call. The big question's been answered. If you believe obstruction politically was never going to be enough to get him, then you shouldn't be afraid of it politically on Capitol Hill. But we'll see. I mean, if it is politically not in the president's best interest to see the details of this report come out, because there's no doubt in my mind the details are going to be far worse than this summary. And right now, it's not going to feel better than it is for him right now, which is a definitive word on number 1. Mueller says no conspiracy, not Barr. That is Mueller proof. That is a big deal. We know voters have a lot of faith in Mueller. A lot of people. That is Mueller saying that. I'll be very curious to see if Democrats will accept this conclusion, since that came from Mueller. On obstruction, Katie, I fully understand if there is a debate and dispute over this, because this was not Mueller's definitive word. This was Bob Barr's word. So this is where there'll be this fight. But again, politically, the toothpaste is already out of the tube, as they say.
Yeah.
So this isn't getting resolved in this country until November 2020.
No doubt about that. I mean, I think what we can take from this is that the investigations will continue in Congress, but ultimately, and who knows how long it will take to potentially see the rest of this report or what we are able to see, but ultimately this is going to go to the voters in 2020. And what the president is going to do, Chuck, and Steve Bannon's made this clear, and anybody who followed the 2016 campaign would assume as well, he's going to use this to his advantage. And the way he's been using it already in the past 2 years, saying that it's all a witch hunt. Right. There was no collusion. There was no conspiracy. When they couldn't find conspiracy or collusion, they moved on to something else. I am the victim here.
It's been good politics for him. It is how he spins up his base. It is how he keeps his base devoted to him. It is how he's politically survived. It is no way to politically thrive. It is no way to govern. He's not going to ever get the 60% to govern, but this is what he's going to do. It's going to be about surviving to the election and seeing if it's enough. And Democrats are going to be in this. They're going to get frustrated, perhaps, by how this investigation is going to get, perhaps how quickly they get to see the report. But there will be voter fatigue on this. And Democrats have to be very wary of that. And do they focus on the investigations, or do they focus on other issues that perhaps voters want to see focused on?
Well,
I think that will have an impact here too, on how aggressive Democrats are.
Well, what we've seen for the 2020 Democrats on the campaign trail so far is that they haven't been paying a ton of attention to the investigation, Chuck, and we saw that in 2018 as well.
The voters out there don't care.
They've been paying attention
care's
to
not the
issues.
right word. They care about it, but they're not following it day to day.
They're not. And so what we saw from the Democrats, and one of the reasons why they did so well in 2018, they argue, is that they paid attention to the issues. They paid attention to health care and the economy and other things. If Democrats in Congress continue with the investigations into the president, continue with subpoenaing various members of his White House or members of his family or members of his orbit, and go down the road of trying to determine whether they think he obstructed justice and whether that potentially is an impeachable offense for this president, do Democrats risk overshadowing, drowning out what Democratic hopefuls for 2020 are doing on the campaign trail?
I think that is a risk. And at the same time, I understand the desire by others who say, wait a minute, you got to prosecute these things even when it's politically not, because if you don't, or if you don't attempt to, you're lowering the floor. You're lowering the bar again, and it is only going to reward this. But I also have been having this own conversation. What would the founders have wanted in this situation? He's in a first term, not a second term. There is, and most people would agree, it's always better to let the voters make a determination in a democracy than a ruling group of elites, right? So it is a first term, and there is a lot to be said of let the public get all the information and let them make the determination themselves about whether they think he has the values to run the rule of law or not. To whether they trust him to be in charge of the criminal justice system, whether things like that. So there is an argument to be said that perhaps if you think back, what would the founders have wanted in this situation, given the time that we're in, they might say, take it to the voters. In a second term, it's a different situation.
Chuck, hang out for 1 second. I just want to reset for anybody who might be tuning in. It is 4:04 right now. About 30 minutes ago, we received a summary of Robert Mueller's findings, the 2-year investigation into President Trump and his presidential campaign, condensed down to 4 pages. Attorney General William Barr has summarized that while the report does not conclude that the president committed a crime, it also does not exonerate him. The evidence developed during the special counsel investigation is not sufficient to establish that the president committed an obstruction of justice offense. That is per Bill Barr and Rod Rosenstein, not per Robert Mueller. Also, the report identifies no actions that, in our judgment, constitutes obstructive conduct. Again, that is per Bill Barr and Rod Rosenstein. Finally, the investigation did not establish that members of the Trump campaign conspired or coordinated or colluded with the Russian government in its election interference activities. Chuck, you're back with me. One other question on Nancy Pelosi. She had said a few weeks ago that she doesn't believe impeachment is something that the Democrats should pursue unless there is bipartisan support of this. Now that we know the principal conclusions from Robert Mueller per William Barr, do you see any way that Nancy Pelosi might change her stance on that?
I doubt it, we just got a statement from Kevin McCarthy, the House Republican leader, and just if this gives you a taste of where congressional leaders are, then the idea of whether we see this whole report, you may start to ask that self. He says it is abundantly clear without a shadow of a doubt there was no collusion, and then he says it's time we move on for the good of the nation. This case is closed. So if that is the sort of mainstream Republican attitude on Capitol Hill, it may slow down the demands and the calls for transparency, and it may slow down. I mean, I think we will eventually see the details of this Mueller report, make the determination for ourselves, but by the time we see it, the spin will have already sort of made its way around, and there may be even a fatigue or an exhaustion factor. Politically, though, Nancy Pelosi looks pretty prescient by taking that off the table. At the end of the day, you don't do something if you don't have the votes in an exercise like that. It is an impeachment. While you may believe it's part of the rule of law, it is a political exercise, not a legal one. And you have to count the votes.
Hallie Jackson's also with us. Hallie, the White House has said all along that there was no collusion. The president greeted reporters on Friday with no collusion, no collusion. The president's orbit has always said no collusion. The president's children have always said no collusion. Today, Robert Mueller found no conspiracy, which essentially is no collusion.
There is no gray area on that piece of it, Katie. When you look at these two buckets, the conspiracy piece, as you say, what's sort of called collusion, and then the obstruction piece. On the conspiracy piece of it, it is black and white. It is very clear that the special counsel did not find that the Trump campaign conspired with Russia. That is already what we're seeing. And forgive me for looking at my phone because we've just received now reaction from the RNC, unsurprisingly now from the Republican National Committee, falling in line with what Chuck read you from Leader McCarthy, from others in the Republican Party, talking about how, and I'm going to quote you here, for years, Democrats and many in the media promised us there was collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia. They were wrong. That is going to be the line from the GOP, I think, from the White House as well. Keep in mind that right now the president is getting ready to board Air Force One, right, where there are televisions, where he will likely be watching coverage of all of this as it goes down, as he leaves from Mar-a-Lago to come back here from the White House. And so politically, you have the reaction from Republicans, as you can see Air Force One there down in South Florida getting ready to make its way back to Washington. There is a chance, by the way, and let me just note for our viewers here, that the president may stop and speak to the assembled reporters traveling with him, the pool, who gather underneath the wing. That would not be unprecedented. The president has done it before. We don't know that he will this time, but that is obviously something that we are watching closely for. So we know the reaction from Republicans here, seizing on that conspiracy, no conspiracy piece. The obstruction piece, that is a gray area, as you and Chuck and others have been talking about, and that is where you are starting to see some of the reaction from Democrats, and where you will continue undoubtedly to see Democrats pushing to see everything that Robert Mueller put together. As it relates to the 2020 reelect, you make the point correctly, I think, that most Democrats are not focusing on the Russia investigation out on the campaign trail. They're just not. They're talking about things like Medicare for all. They're talking about issues. They're talking about the Green New Deal, things that voters want to be hearing about. However, President Trump, who, by the way, goes to a campaign rally later on this week, he's going to be out in Michigan for that, loves to talk about Robert Mueller. I see the president making a piñata of the special counsel, of, frankly, the media as well. And you're already starting to see that in a new tweet out from Eric Trump, the president's son, going after the media, sort of accusing the media now of trying to harp on this narrative that they say was overhyped and incorrect. That is going to be that twofold attack is where you will see, I think, based on our reporting, the president really hone in on the campaign trail repeatedly. Listen, he will probably do it Thursday. He'll probably do it for the next 500 plus days until this election happens, because the president feels personally aggrieved by this. We know this because he tweets about it. He talks about it. This has been the cloud that has been hanging over his West Wing since the day he stood on the steps of the Capitol and took the oath of office. So this is something that is a significant moment in time for this White House, which is why it's significant. By the way, after a huge week of Twitter frenzy tweets, Katie, nothing. I mean, two innocuous good morning, make America great tweets again, and that is all we've heard from the president so far.
And I wonder if he actually changes his tune on Robert Mueller and starts to call him a good American here, because he did not find conspiracy, and he will say that he was not partisan and he was not conflicted, and they aren't 13 angry Democrats, but that they did the president a service. But at the same time, Hallie, in this report, or in this summary, Bill Barr makes a point that Robert Mueller says the president didn't commit a crime, but it does not exonerate him.
Yeah, and it's those words, right? Those does not exonerate him that you will hear again and again from Democrats, right? Because that is sort of the murky waters here. I think you're right. Now, the president may change his tune about Robert Mueller. You may hear the argument it'd be very difficult for the president to change his tune about Mueller, given just how sort of intensely he has attacked him in this investigation repeatedly, in writing, publicly, on camera. But this is a president who has reversed course on people before, as we all know well from the story of Jeff Sessions and others who have fallen in and out of favor with the president at various times in his administration. The obstruction piece of it is, again, much less clear, because Robert Mueller did not draw sort of a final line here on the issue of obstruction. It says, yes, the president, and we have the quote here, does not conclude that the president committed a crime, but it does not exonerate him. That's already where you're starting to see the question marks, right, from Democrats, from people who have concerns about the president. And again, all along, and we've been saying this, there are two pieces of this here, right? Overall, if you step back, big picture, there's the question of Donald Trump's legal liability, and then there's the question of his political liability, right? And what this means for him politically. And so legally, while Robert Mueller has come to the conclusion, based on Attorney General Barr's letter, that there was no conspiracy, no coordination with the Russian government, which was the sort of thesis, the central piece of his investigation. The other piece was obstruction, and there it is just not as clear. So we're working our sources. We're hoping to get some reaction for you soon. I think it's interesting that we understand, based on my colleague Kristen Welker, that there will be some kind of a statement from the legal team. So we're looking for that, Katie.
We are waiting for that. Let's go to Kristen Welker, who is also at the White House. Kristen, what do you have?
Well, the early reaction from the legal team is it's very good for us. So you can expect, essentially, just to build on what Hallie's saying, they are prepared to take a major victory lap here at the White House within the president's legal team. They were sort of weighing a number of different scenarios, this scenario being, politically speaking, the strongest one, arguably, for President Trump. And so I think you're going to see that expressed. I know that they had sort of thought through some early reaction, but clearly they're trying to determine exactly what that victory lap is going to look like when they put pen to pad. Just to set the scene here at the White House, Hallie's standing outside. I'm inside. Just had a chance to run upstairs where all of the White House officials, the press staff works. They are all huddled in Press Secretary Sarah Sanders' office right now, likely trying to determine next steps and what the official reaction, official statement is going to be here from the White House. Not clear that Sarah's in that office right now, because I know she was traveling with the president. But bottom line, they are hashing through what their reaction is going to be here. And again, President Trump set to land here at the White House in just a short time from now, Katie. He usually does not talk when he returns home from the weekend. I think you might see him sort of break that streak and come and speak with us. We'll have to wait and see. But I would anticipate he's going to want to weigh in. And again, he does have that campaign rally a little bit later on this week. So undoubtedly, he's going to be using this. Look, I spoke to Steve Bannon earlier today, who said he's prepared to weaponize the Mueller report. What that really tells us is that among the president's staunchest supporters, they were calling this a victory even before we knew the details. So now they sort of have some meat on the bones to back it up, Katie.
And does this now mean the president can use this to convince others that might have been on the fence about him, might not have enjoyed this investigation, might have had questions surrounding this investigation, to say, hey, listen, I was right, it was a hoax, I am the victim here, you should vote for me? Does he use that as a way to broaden his appeal? That is still an open question. Sarah Sanders has just released a statement while you were on with us, Kristen. She says the special counsel did not find any collusion and did not find any obstruction. Although the special counsel did not find obstruction. That was what AG Barr and Rod Rosenstein found. Attorney General Barr and Deputy Attorney General Rosenstein further determined there was no obstruction. The findings of the Department of Justice are a total and complete exoneration obstruction of the President of the United States. Number one, the special counsel did not find collusion. Sarah Sanders is right to say that. She is not right to say that they did not find any obstruction. They left that question explicitly up to both William Barr and Rod Rosenstein, and William Barr and Rosenstein determined that there was no obstruction. She says it is a total and complete exoneration of the president. The Mueller summary, according to Bill Barr, says while the president did not commit a crime, it does not exonerate him. That was expressly said in that letter. So even in circumstances where the news is good for them, they have to be incorrect. So that's Katie, consistent, I guess, with this White House.
Well, and Katie, that's why you are going to see such a pitched battle to get the actual report. Jerry Nadler earlier today on Meet the Press said essentially arguing that some of the documents are protected by executive privilege isn't an argument because they've already been subjected to this investigation. So you're going to see Democrats really push to try to see the entire report by special counsel Robert Mueller. Now, undoubtedly, what I think you might see also is a desire by the White House and some others for the entire report to not be released, at least publicly. And they point to, ironically, the case of Hillary Clinton. They say, look, in the case of Hillary Clinton, you essentially had James Comey saying she didn't cross any legal lines, but here are all of the things she did that showed misjudgment. They say they don't want to see a repeat of that. They also point out that they were critical of how he handled that matter at the time, Katie.
But Kristen, I don't understand. Even on a good day where the news is good for them, they still insist on lying. They still put out incorrect statements. Why in the world would Sarah Huckabee Sanders want to cloud what happened today with this summary, cloud the good news of it, by putting out a statement that's full of two factual errors?
Well, she's seizing upon the final conclusion by
from
the
Bill
Attorney
Barr
General.
And Rosenstein,
and
not
I think
from Mueller.
that. And by the way, when we hear from President Trump, it's a little bit of a preview, right, of how they are going to spin. Not unusual for White House's administrations to do that, but these findings. And so I think when we hear from President Trump, whether that's today, whether that's a little bit later on this week, I think you're getting a good preview of what he is going to say. But make no doubt about it, again, and I keep going back to this, even Nikki Haley earlier today, before we knew the full results of what Barr was going to say, was essentially saying it's time to move on. There are no more indictments. And so you put all of these things together, and politically speaking, this is a very good day for President Trump, and they're going to be spiking the football today and right through Election Day, likely, Katie.
Yes, again, although I don't think we can call it spin. I think that is lying. Let's go to Ari Melber, our chief legal analyst here at MSNBC and NBC News, also the host of The Beat. Ari, what is your first reaction?
My first reaction is the most important parts of this letter are the direct quotes from the Mueller report. Everything else is Barr's views and conclusions, which are also significant since he's Mueller's boss, but are not the Mueller report everyone's been waiting for. And anyone in any field knows that there's plenty that can be done with characterization and conclusion. So in those direct quotes, there is clearly, as you've been reporting, good news for the Trump campaign and President Trump, in that it echoes what we really knew as a clue from Friday night, because this ended without any indictments on collusion, election conspiracy. And here we see a quote of a finding that there was not a collusion, election conspiracy between the Russian government and the Trump campaign and associates. Now, there isn't supposed to be one. That's something most campaigns take for granted. They're not even suspected of. Yeah. But it is, obviously, after a 22-month probe, a very significant finding. Second, I think where we're going to see a huge fight, and this is what I've really been reading into in the letter, is we see already some gap distance between Mueller's take on obstruction, what he actually carefully did in what we understand to be his conclusions, and Barr going further. So let me tell you what I mean, and then we could get into it more if you like or you have time. We see very clearly, as you were just discussing with regard to the overstatement by the White House, that Bob Mueller looked at potential obstruction, looked at that evidence, went through it and investigated it, and said that the president is not exonerated, nor is he, in the view of Mueller, guilty of a federal crime within the ambit of his probe. So that is, to put it simply, a middle ground. And this letter then goes well beyond that. It accurately quotes that. So credit to Barr that we only know that because he's quoting this, and we don't have any reason to think he's misquoting it. But then having said that, Barr goes much further and says he now, today, after what we know to be a short time, 2 days, has concluded on his own that there's no obstruction by the president. Now, if that rings in people's ears, it should, because people may remember that in the case of President Clinton or President Nixon, the questions around presidential obstruction as a potential high crime are generally dealt with, or as lawyers would say, adjudicated by the House, not by the president's own Justice Department. And so that right there is a glaring sign. And that, I think, is interesting.
Well, what they had with Bill Clinton was that he perjured himself. There was a difference there.
Well, I'm not referring to the underlying facts. But the comparison I'm making is that the House was the decision maker on determining obstruction, meaning whatever you think happened. Let's say you say for the argument President A didn't obstruct and President B did. Who decides that? Well, in our constitutional system, the reason why these probes are so volatile is, without predetermining anything about tonight's letter, it is typically the House that deals with presidential abuses of power if they are investigated or believed to have occurred. And so Barr, let's make no mistake here, he's within his lawful authority. We've been reporting that he's been doing this by the book, but he is making a judgment call that ultimately, in cases where there have been found abuses of power, it's not the Attorney General who has the last word on that. So that's him coming out of the gates in this letter and saying, I'm quoting that Mueller found no election conspiracy, boom. I'm quoting that Mueller came to a middle ground, that is to say, did not reach a final conclusion saying the president did or didn't commit obstruction, and now I'm going to tip on that and say he didn't. And whether in our system of government and whether the Congress wants to deal with that or not, I think is a big open question today.
Ari, stick with us. Hallie Jackson, you have a statement from the president's lawyers.
Pieces of information. I was on the phone with Jay Sekulow, Katie, while you were having that conversation. He says that he is feeling, of course, Sekulow is the president's outside attorney. He is feeling very pleased at this moment in time. We understand the president's legal team got the report, got the letter, essentially 2 minutes after it had been released out to the public, essentially. Sekulow was rather cagey, would not say whether he has spoken with the president about this, but we do expect a fuller statement from the president's legal team sometime in the next 5 minutes. And it's my understanding that my colleague Kelly O'Donnell, who is traveling with the president in South Florida, spoke with Rudy Giuliani as we were on the phone working our sources. And Giuliani tells NBC the result is, quote, better than expected. That should give you a very clear sense of the mindset of the president's legal team at this moment and of the White House in general. And here's another piece, another clue that gives us a window in their thinking. The White House has just sent out a statement, just sent out something to reporters here with key findings as they see it from the Attorney General's summary from this letter. Now, they seized on 3 sentences, 3 pieces of information. The first one won't surprise you. The first one is that sentence about how the special counsel's investigation did not find that the Trump campaign or anyone associated with it conspired or colluded with Russia. This is, expired or coordinated with Russia. This is the no collusion sentence, if you will. We knew they were going to seize on it. We already started to see them do so. So it is unsurprising that they are doing so unofficially. Fine. The other 2 pieces of information that they're highlighting themselves are very interesting because they both relate to this issue of obstruction. And they talk about, they've plucked now these 2 passages from the Attorney General's letter saying the report identifies no actions that in our judgment constitute obstructive conduct. And they also highlight that part where Barr says Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein and I have concluded that the evidence developed during the special counsel's investigation is not sufficient to establish the president committed an obstruction of justice offense. That is Bill Barr's interpretation of Robert Mueller's report. That was not Robert Mueller's presentation of the facts to Bill Barr, because Robert Mueller did not come down explicitly one way or the other per this letter as it related to obstruction, and in fact explicitly said that while there was no evidence that the president committed a crime related to obstruction, this investigation did not exonerate him. So the White House is, listen, in essence, cherry-picking pieces of this letter that they want to highlight, that they want to tout, that they want to get out there and have people talking about. And again, while it is fairly black and white on the sort of no collusion, no conspiracy piece, that is not the case on the obstruction piece. And so these are among the questions that we will have for President Trump as he starts to get ready to head back to Washington. And forgive me, I'm looking at my emails here because, as you can imagine, our emails and texts are blowing up a little bit, and it looks as though there has now been a call for Bill Barr to testify. Unsurprisingly, the next step of this, Katie, may be sort of our live coverage of looking at Bill Barr, perhaps even Robert Mueller testifying to Congress. We don't know if or when those things could happen.
That is a tweet from Jerry Nadler, who says, in light of the very concerning discrepancies and final decision-making at the Justice Department following the special counsel report, where Mueller did not exonerate the president, we will be calling Attorney General Barr in to testify before House Judiciary in the near future. Again, Mueller said that although they did not find evidence the president committed a crime, they also did not exonerate him. Those words in the report. Joining me now on the phone is MSNBC legal analyst and former Solicitor General Neil Katyal. Neil, this is going to come down to trust. Do you trust the assessment of Attorney General William Barr and Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein?
I really wanted to trust them, but quite honestly, I think this letter causes me much more concern, grave concerns, really, because remember, Mueller, after 2 years of investigation, doesn't draw a conclusion one way or the other on obstruction of justice. He says there's evidence on both sides. And then you have Attorney General Barr within 48 hours of receiving this saying, I conclude that the evidence isn't there. And in particular, he says there's not evidence of Trump's intent. Now, how the heck does he determine that in 48 hours after a 2-year investigation, and particularly without even trying to interview Trump? If the whole question is Trump's state of mind, I would expect any reasonable prosecutor to try and get that information. That appears not to have been done. There's nothing in the letter about that. So I do think that there's going to be a fear among the American public that there's been a whitewash here. I think there has to be congressional testimony by Barr. I think there will have to be, Mueller coming forward too, and the American public seeing the report. But absolutely, I think that this letter raises far more concerns than it does provide answers.
How long does it take to go through the special counsel's report in order to identify material that cannot be released publicly, the grand jury material and anything else?
That's such a great question, because the end of the Barr letter today says, I have to, I want to release as much of the Mueller report as I can, but I'm worried about grand jury material, and so I'm going to have to launch a process to undertake that. Now, it's amazing to me that a guy who could conclude that in 48 hours that, Trump didn't obstruct justice and look through all that evidence couldn't also identify the 6E material in a similar time frame. So I'd expect him to apply the same standards of expediency to this review process. But even the review process, he can go to a court tomorrow and say, I want the entire report released. That's not hard to do. So, this, I think, it appears to be a little more of a delay than anything else. And again, I hate saying that, but I have to say, given what Barr found on obstruction of justice, I think all of us should be very concerned about the even-handedness of the way this investigation was treated.
Neil, you were someone, though, that had said previously that we should be trusting Bill Barr. What about those who may be listening to you now saying that because Bill Barr didn't come up with the conclusion that you might have wanted him to, I'm not saying that you had a stake in this one way or the other, but might be thinking that now you're going to say you don't trust him?
No, well, first of all, I don't think I've ever said, every American should trust Barr. I've certainly hoped that he would do the right thing. And on Friday, when he released the initial statement, I thought that was a good statement, but I don't think I've ever gone further than that. I do think that here I think there is reason to be very concerned given what he wrote here, that you have a 2-year investigation and Mueller doesn't make a final determination. He says there's evidence on both sides. And then you have Barr swoop in and within 48 hours make a decision. There is something deeply troubling about that, and it's the same troubling thing identified during the Barr hearings, which is he wrote this kooky 19-page memo which said effectively presidents can't obstruct justice. I'm worried that this is part of that same, ludicrous legal view. So I don't know what Barr's ultimate decisions were here because he doesn't tell us, and that's, I think, the point. The American public need to know, Congress needs to know, how exactly did he conclude there was no obstruction of justice? And if it's really about the lack of intent on the part of Trump, how the heck could he know that when he didn't even try and interview Trump?
And we should point out that on the question of obstruction, Robert Mueller did not make an assessment. He laid out both sides of the issue and allowed Bill Barr and Rod Rosenstein to make their own determination on that. They made it, as Neil was saying, in less than 48 hours. Joining me now, Neil, stick with us if you can, is Democratic Congressman Steve Cohen of Tennessee. He sits on the House Judiciary Committee. Congressman, what is your first reaction?
Well, I think Ari and Neil did a good analysis. The fact is, what is in this letter to us said, first, Mueller was not making a traditional prosecutorial judgment. Those are very interesting words. And then said, as you've well said, he did not draw a conclusion one way or the other on obstruction. does not draw that conclusion. It also does not exonerate the president. And when Rudy says it's better than expected, they must have been expecting worse. The fact is, the Judiciary Committee is the elected people's house. Bill Barr was not elected by anybody. Trump, when he was attacking Mueller, said he wasn't elected by anybody. Well, Bill Barr wasn't elected by anybody, nor was Rod Rosenstein. The Congress is elected. We need to see all of the information there to make a conclusion, to get information, to let the public make a decision on whether there was obstruction of justice to protect the Trump administration and Trump team from being involved and cited for collusion with the Russians. They said there was no collusion, but there was obstruction, and that's important. And the People's House needs to know it, and the People's House needs to have the complete report so that we can have hearings on this issue and pass laws to protect the American public.
How much time are you willing to give William Barr to get more of the report out to the public? He said at the end of the letter that they're going to go through and try and take out what they cannot release by law, grand jury material, and then release what they can. How much time are you going to give him to do that?
You know, as far as time to give him, I'm going to go back to what you said to Neil. I was never a person that thought Bill Barr was somebody to be listened to and respected. Bill Barr was appointed by Donald Trump after he decided that Jeff Sessions wasn't his Roy Cohn. He wasn't his ace attorney looking out for him, not for the country, not for justice. And Bill Barr was put in there for a reason. I don't doubt he went to a group like the Federalist Society who picked him his judges and said, find me a guy that'll be my Roy Cohn. Find me that guy, and Bill Barr's that man. For him to make this statement, Mueller wasn't part of it. You know, they said he was going to do all this stuff with Mueller and Rosenstein. Well, Mueller wasn't part of that decision that says we're not coming to a conclusion on obstruction. That's what Mueller said. They come to a conclusion that says there's nothing there. Well, Barr's there because he's appointed by Trump. He's not elected by the people, and you can put very little credence in what he's saying. He is a Trump appointee put in to protect Trump. That's why Trump put him in. There is just too much out there for the American public to let this go. We need to get all the facts. There needs to be transparency. There needs to be a release of this entire document. And there's no sources and methods. A minimal amount that could be ferreted out in no time.
There's grand jury material, though.
Grand jury
material
testimony,
is secret by law.
It's secret, but it doesn't take long to do that. And the fact is, they could probably do that in a classified setting.
What doesn't take
they could
long
have a
to do
classified
that?
hearing.
I'm
we are all classified.
So you're going to ask to declassify that information, or are you going to subpoena the grand jury material to try and make it public?
I'm not saying that. I'm not saying to make it public. I'm saying that the Congress can get a classified briefing from the Justice Department on what's in there, and we can know what the information is. We need to know that information, and we have classified standing, and we've been allowed. We hear all kind of classified material. This is no different. This is less important than classified material we hear about the Saudis and who killed the journalist and the Russians and you name it. We hear that. This is only it's classified, but it's to protect the president and his administration. Well, that's much less.
The grand jury material is secret per the grand jury restrictions, but you can get a court order to clear that. Are you alleging, though, speaking in a broader way, are you alleging that there's a cover-up going on by the Attorney General?
I think we'll know that better if we get to see the entire report and get to see the information from which he made his determination. Because without that, there is at least prima facie case that Trump had made clear he wanted his man in, his Roy Cohn. He appointed Bill Barr after Bill Barr wrote letters and articles that were consistent with what the president wanted to see. I think there is a prima facie case to be suspicious of any conclusions he draws that exonerates the president when Bob Mueller did not exonerate the president. He specifically did not exonerate him. And for Barr to do it, there's certainly reasons to find the data that go to the best material, the best evidence, which is the entire report for the Judiciary Committee to look into to see whether or not there was obstruction of justice.
Will you be calling Bob Mueller to testify? Should he?
Well, I won't be doing it. Jerry Nadler will be doing it, and I'll be right there supporting him, as I'm sure the entire Democratic team and the Judiciary Committee will.
Will you ask, Mr. Nadler?
I can ask, but I don't have to ask. I mean, it'd be like asking the Phillies, do you want Bryce Harper?
Who do you want to see in front of your committee after this?
I'd like to see Barr, and I'd like to see Mueller both.
Congressman Cohen. Congressman, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
You're welcome, Katie.
I want to go to the table because we haven't been to any of you yet, all of our legal minds. First to you, Tom Winter. In reporting this out, what have we learned about the special counsel's investigation?
Well, I mean, it's significant, and frankly, as somebody who covers these type of investigations, to explain to people the size and scope of what occurred here, 2,800 subpoenas were issued, almost 500 search warrants were executed. Now, those don't have to be physical search warrants. In other words, they weren't going necessarily into people's homes or businesses, but 500 search warrants approximately were issued. 50 pen registers were issued. That is fairly extraordinary to me. A pen register is the ability for the government to track where and when your cell phone is being activated, who you're calling, and for how long that call is, or who's calling you. It did not allow the special counsel's office to listen into those calls or to look at maybe a text messages sent back and forth, but it does establish where people are at a certain place in time and what they're doing on that phone. That's significant to me. 40 FBI agents detailed to this, 19 attorneys were detailed to this investigation. They also had intelligence analysts and other people that were involved. So to me, that speaks to an investigation that was really thorough from a law enforcement, from an investigating standpoint. Another thing I want to bring up, I think that is key and germane to the conversation that you're having here, Katie. The Justice Department typically almost never brings an obstruction of justice charge if there's not an underlying crime. So in this particular instance, they have determined that there was no coordination between the Trump campaign or the president as a candidate and the Russian government. So if there's no underlying crime here, there's typically no obstruction case that would be brought. What is interesting, what it doesn't explicitly say in the letter from AG Barr, is whether or not those efforts, potential efforts to obstruct justice, in some way hindered the investigation. Yeah. So that's something that I actually would really like to know. I think that would be important here, whether or not some of the things that that this is referred to.
Do you not think, though, that was addressed yesterday or the day before when William Barr said, Special Counsel Mueller said that their investigation was not hampered?
I'm really glad that you raised that point. So I think in that, he said that no prosecutions, he was not stopped from making any indictments or from seeking any indictments. That's what was in the letter. So, but whether or not he could have sought indictments if he was able to get access to certain information, that's one thing that I think is still a little unclear. It doesn't seem like that's the case, but that's something I would like to know a little bit more about. And then just to confirm our reporting from Friday, Katie, the letter from AG Barr explicitly states some things that we've known, which is that some investigations from Robert Mueller have been farmed out to other federal jurisdictions. In addition to that, there are no more indictments coming from the special counsel's office, and the letter explicitly states there's no sealed indictments waiting to come out in the days and months ahead.
Well, let's talk about the point that Tom made a moment ago, that DOJ doesn't typically charge obstruction if there is no underlying crime, and Bob Mueller found no underlying crime of conspiracy or collusion.
Yeah, but the statute doesn't say underlying crime. The statute says pending proceeding. So to me, that's not controlling whatsoever. And the big bizarre thing here is that Bob Mueller does all this work, and then on obstruction, what's the most obvious happening in plain sight? I mean, apparently he's not even allowed to give an opinion.
Well, are you saying he's not allowed to give an opinion, or did he choose not to?
I don't really know. And I think that's the big question for me. As I looked at this, I was confused by that. Why didn't he make an opinion about that? He's an experienced prosecutor.
Doug, what do you think?
Well, first of all, I agree with the statement on the law. In other words, if you're investigating something and I say to a witness, go in there and lie, that can be obstruction regardless of the underlying. But Tom makes a very good point, though, because I think coming out of this letter, I think it is important that when you have the main issue is this question of coordination or collusion, and they conclude fairly strongly, let's face it, put politics out of it for a minute, legally, then the obstruction is that much weaker, as Tom explained. And I agree with them, but Cynthia's right. Legally, it's not an absolute flat prohibition. You're right.
No, it's not.
Right.
No. And then especially when you're looking at an obstruction case, when Barr came in, and Neil Catel's right, he always has had this kooky interpretation of obstruction. Right. That's why it's really important to have a traditional prosecutor's answer about if there's obstruction.
Joining us now by phone is Trump's own lawyer, Jay Sekulow. Mr. Sekulow, thank you for joining us. Give us your initial reactions.
I'm very pleased, both from the outset of this entire inquiry, we have said that there was no collusion between the Trump campaign and the Russians, and that determination proved to be correct. We also said there was no obstruction, and that also became correct. So we're very, very pleased. We think this is a complete victory for the president. And I also would say that the process upon which this moved this weekend it was very, very good for the American people that this amount of information so far has been released this quickly.
What about the portion of the report that says, although the president did not commit a crime, it does not exonerate him?
Well, that goes to the statements from the special counsel's report, where they said, but you have to point out the fact, as you did, that there's not evidence that he committed a crime. They didn't exonerate. The special counsel did not. They left that to the Department of Justice to determine within there, because they are part of the Department of Justice, unlike an independent counsel. And what happened was that the Department of Justice made the conclusion that there was no obstruction because there was no underlying crime, and that the actions that were taken, as they noted publicly, the report identifies no actions in our judgment that constitute obstructive conduct. And that's the conclusion of the Department of Justice. The
president never sat down with Robert Mueller in person. Can you now tell us what Robert Mueller asked Donald Trump, at least on paper?
I can't. I cannot discuss that with you at this point. That would be not appropriate for me to do. We did answer a series of questions in writing that they asked for, and the president did respond to those.
If Congress continues this and at some point tries to talk to you or talk to anybody involved in this investigation, how do you expect to handle those requests?
I'm the president's lawyer. Communications that I have are attorney-client privilege.
In terms of the report and what will be released to the public, are you expecting to request that anything is privileged in the report, or will you allow it to be made public as is?
So that's not a decision. So just to be clear there, on the issue of whether there's executive material, privileged material, that would be a decision that would be engaged in between the Department of Justice and the White House, not the president's. That would not be me, Rudy Giuliani, or the Raskins, our legal team. That would be a decision that's made by the White House in consultation with the Department of Justice. But I think everybody would agree that General Barr moved very quickly here, gets the report on a Friday at about 5 o'clock, and 48 hours later delivers what they call the principal conclusions. I thought that was impressive, and I thought it was well thought out, and obviously we're very, very pleased with the result. But with regard to what happens to the report in the future, that's really not in the jurisdiction of the president's private lawyers.
Have you requested a copy of the Mueller report in its entirety?
We have not.
Are you going to?
Nope.
Why not?
Not at this point. Because the way the regulations are written, it is a confidential report between the special counsel and the attorney general. And we don't have, under the regulations, and I think Neil wrote those regulations, we don't have the right to go in and demand access to the underlying report.
Do you believe Congress should stop investigating?
Look, yes. I think that this whole issue of, I can not count the number of times people on all of the networks said, we have significant evidence of collusion, as members of Congress, between the president himself and the Russians. Some called it treasonous conduct. Others called it, collusion or conspiracy with the Russians and interference by the Russians knowingly made by the president. All those statements were made. The special counsel and the Department of Justice took a very contrary view. There was no collusion. That was the basis upon which this investigation was launched, and the conclusion was unequivocal that there was none.
Can you maybe shed some light on this for us? It's a question that we've been asking a lot. Why did so many of those around Donald Trump, on the question of contacts with Russia, lie about it if there was nothing nefarious going on?
I cannot address that as the president's lawyer. It's not something that we would know or we would deal with. But the president, and they said the campaign as well in the report, that there was no evidence of collusion, period, and unequivocal.
Have you spoken to the president?
If I did, I wouldn't tell you.
Why not?
I wouldn't. But I don't want to get into conversations I had with the president or have not had with the president. But needless to say, we're very pleased.
What about the president himself? And because I'm sure you've talked to him about this. I have not asked him this other than in the moment.
The White House just sent out a statement.
I asked him about this in the moment, but maybe you can shed some more light on this. Why would he get on a stage and ask Russia to find Hillary Clinton's emails?
I'm not going to what we call relitigate facts or circumstances. You know what? All of these facts and circumstances that were out there were obviously evaluated by the special counsel, and they concluded there was no collusion.
The president has tweeted, no collusion, no obstruction, complete and total exoneration. Keep America great. Were you giving him advice over the weekend to keep quiet until this came out?
Now, if I was your lawyer, would you want me telling you the advice I did give or did not give to you? You would not ask me to do that. I'm not going to do that.
What about in determining obstruction? I have a number of legal minds on this panel right now who are questioning how quickly Bill Barr was able to determine that there was no obstruction. We know that Robert Mueller presented both sides of the issue, evidence to say that he did obstruct, evidence to say that he did not obstruct. A lot of that was in the public sphere already. We've been reporting on it, the Comey firing, the tweets, et cetera, the behavior presumably to Jeff Sessions among those. That's what we're presuming. What do you say to those who say that ask how quickly can William Barr really get to the bottom of that?
Well, first of all, the Deputy Attorney General of the United States was involved in this from the outset. And as you saw in the letter, he was not only consulted, but they specifically referenced that both the Attorney General and the Deputy Attorney General, Rod Rosenstein, and I have concluded, I'm reading from the letter, that the evidence developed during the special counsel investigation is not sufficient to establish that the president committed an obstruction of justice offense. And they also importantly said here that our determination was made without regard to and is not based on the constitutional considerations that surround the indictment and criminal prosecution of a sitting president. That's important because it was not a declination because you can't indict a sitting president. They made a factual determination based on the evidence that there was not evidence of obstruction.
Why did the president not sit back and allow this investigation to happen? Why was he so involved? The
investigation did happen. It's been going on for almost 2 years. Bob Mueller was not fired with all the attacks on that issue and that were made. Bob Mueller was not fired. No FBI agent that was involved in the case was interfered with. The fact of the matter is there was no collusion. There was no obstruction determination here. This is a vindication of the legal positions, but also the factual positions that we've been advocating since the outset.
Mr. Sekulow, the President of the United States is approaching reporters. We're going to listen in. Thank you for calling in.
All right, thank you.
So after a long look, after a long investigation, after so many people have been so badly hurt, after not looking at the other side, where a lot of bad things happened, a lot of horrible things happened, a lot of very bad things happened for our country. It was just announced there was no collusion with Russia, the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. There was no collusion with Russia. There was no obstruction and none whatsoever. And it was a complete and total exoneration. It's a shame that our country had to go through this. To be honest, it's a shame that your president has had to go through this before I even got elected. It began. And it began illegally. And hopefully somebody's going to look at the other side. This was an illegal takedown that failed. And hopefully somebody's going to be looking at the other side. So it's complete exoneration, no collusion, no obstruction. Thank you very much. Thank you.
President saying no collusion, no obstruction, not taking any questions from reporters. I think you can call that a 2020 preview of how he will use this investigation or try to use it to his advantage going forward, saying that he was unfairly victimized and that there was a segment of Washington and of the country that was trying to unfairly take him out of office. He did say over and over again on the campaign trail in 2016 that there was a conspiracy to keep him out of office because he was going to work for the American public and not work for the establishment. I imagine he'll use
This is an NBC News special report. Here's Kate Snow.
Good afternoon. President Trump has just made his first comments following the release of the major findings of special counsel Robert Mueller's investigation. That summary says the Mueller report did not establish that members of the Trump campaign conspired or coordinated with Russia to influence the U.S. election. On the issue of obstruction of justice, the special counsel did not draw a conclusion, but the Attorney General says there was not sufficient evidence to establish the president obstructed justice. Here's what the president just said moments ago at the Palm Beach International Airport.
So after a long look, after a long investigation, after so many people have been so badly hurt, after not looking at the other side, where a lot of bad things happened, a lot of horrible things happened, a lot of very bad things happened for our country. It was just announced there was no collusion with Russia, the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. There was no collusion with Russia. There was no obstruction, and none whatsoever. And it was a complete and total exoneration. It's a shame that our country had to go through this. To be honest, it's a shame that your president has had to go through this before I even got elected. It began. And it began illegally. And hopefully somebody's going to look at the other side. This was an illegal takedown that failed. And hopefully somebody's going to be looking at the other side. So it's complete exoneration. No collusion, no obstruction. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Let's go quickly to Chief White House Correspondent Hallie Jackson. Hallie.
What you heard from the president is not surprising, Kate, but let's put it into context here. When the president talks about no collusion in the sense that the special counsel did not find that the Trump campaign coordinated with Russia in the election, he is correct. On the issue of obstruction, however, when the president says this was a complete and total exoneration, Robert Mueller specifically said that this report, while it doesn't conclude that the president committed a crime, it does not exonerate him. Keep in mind, this is not over for Democrats. Jerry Nadler, a key congressman over on the House side, wants to see Attorney General Bill Barr in front of his committee soon.
All right, Hallie, thank you. Of course, we will continue to monitor all developments throughout the rest of the day. We'll be back for a full report on NBC Nightly News. Hope you can join us there. You can also look at our NBC News app anytime. For now, I'm Kate Snow, NBC News in New York.